with my friend Alan. How are you, Alan?
I am good. How are you?
Brilliant. As you can see, it's a little bit of a different setup today because we're doing this live because our schedules have not matched up for the last 4 weeks, I think, and we haven't had the opportunity to sit down and talk history. But you recommended that we should do a live thing, and I was like, okay, let's try it.
Yeah, because with the Zoom sessions, we have a 40-minute time, and very often I felt we were getting cut off abruptly, which I hated. And I don't know, like this seems to be a feature. It must be streamlining on how we add the videos to our channel. So why
Yeah,
not give it a shot?
yeah, I think this is interesting too. The weird part is you look like you're at a professional setting, and I look like I'm in some sort of beauty shop because I'll explain why this is the setup I have in my apartment. I had to change everything around when my TV died. So now my TV is there where I used to put
Oh,
camera. And so when I face the front with my window at this time of day, because of the lovely natural light, it's bright in my face. So if I don't have my blinds on, you don't see anything. You see a white thing. That's it. And I think people see enough of white things on YouTube. So let's see some lovely, luscious brown skin on this channel. And and I like the effect that it's creating. Vertical lines seem to be slimming my face. So I think that's a good way to look at it.
it's really interesting. I like seeing you like this. It's
Yes, seeing me behind bars, I know. So I thought that because we're going to be discussing history once again, I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about a piece of Indian history that doesn't get that much attention as other periods of Indian history. If people remember, if they're paying attention, that the last topic that we discussed was the Vedic period and the Janapatha period when Buddhism came into existence and the Mahabharata story started to evolve. All of that was what we discussed. Today, I thought we would discuss the period between the two major periods of Indian history, between the Vedic period and between the establishment of the Mauryan Empire in the third century BCE. There is a period of about 300 years that usually getting doesn't get as much attention. But this is a period in which a lot of what we understand as exports of India, as Indic ideas, foundational civilizational ideas of India get shaped during this period. I know the Vedic scriptures come into existence earlier than that. The Brahminical order comes into existence earlier than that. Buddhism comes into existence during this period. But again, how kings start to perceive themselves, how they show themselves to the audience, to the public, how the religions evolve, the philosophical concepts of India, how they evolve, all of this, I think, is solidified in this period when one particular state, and by state I mean a sovereign, independent political state or kingdom, starts to dominate the narrative in India. And we'll see this particular state go on to establish its hegemony all over North India and become the dominant state in India and control the narrative for the next 1,000 years. That is, of course, Magadha. We mentioned it a little bit, I think, in the previous videos, but this is the period in which Magadha rises to the top and establishes itself as the dominant power. That is the wonderful story that I want to discuss in this episode, in this show. And in conjunction with it, we'll also get to discuss an episode that doesn't get much attention in Indian history, but in world history is very, very well documented and discussed, which is the campaigns of Alexander. Before I begin yammering, I wanted to ask you, what is your awareness of Alexander and this period of India's history?
God.
And I'm putting you on the spot, but you're a good one of the reasons I love talking with you is you give a good understanding of what the general Indian public is like with Indian history. You are slightly a little bit more aware of things than most of the people I come in contact with, but
Oh shit. Okay.
what do you
So
learn from the
uh,
next?
in the historical context, I don't really know. Like because in the world context, I know he was one of the first emperors, like that scale of conquering and colonization was like,
Yeah,
nobody has seen it ever before. That was like the first kind of one of its kind. Um, I know Alexander had really good features.
Aristotle.
Uh, yes. And I mean, that's like when we talk about philosophy and the thought, like the relevance of that period when it's talked in the philosophical context, it's so it's so important. Like it's so many fundamental questions that laid the path for philosophy as such was
Yeah.
discussed during that time, and to be taught a ruler, an emperor taught by Aristotle. So I think the impact of Alexander's invasion, I have no idea what the impacts are. I've never read on it, but I can only assume that it would have been very significant and huge. And we might have seen a lot of, like you said, new establishments of things that has lasted for so much time.
Okay. So
That was a
that's
lot of words. Okay.
understanding of the Alexandrian experience for the general public as well. Uh, the context within India is very different when it comes to Alexander's invasions. Uh, when in comparison to the rest of the world, particularly Europe and the Middle East, the experience is totally entirely different. And that is as it should be. It's only that one perspective has tended to dominate the narratives for so long because, again, it's a Eurocentric, tale. Because Alexander is a European invader coming to Central Asia, so that makes a difference. So yes, I just wanted to gauge how much you know before I start lecturing. So the period under discussion is roughly from 600 BCE to, I want to say, 320s BCE, because 321 BCE is when Chandragupta Maurya establishes the Mauryan Empire. So that is a period, is what I'm calling the pre-imperial period of Magadha. I call it the pre-imperial period, more commonly known as the Mahajanapada period in Indian historical context. It is because it is a period in which several, but notably 16, kingdoms established themselves all over northern India, from stretching all the way from what is today Afghanistan to Bihar, from the Himalayas in the north to roughly the Deccan. In this area, 16 major kingdoms established themselves. As we discussed earlier, these were small tribal chieftainships that had slowly evolved into actual kingdoms. Some of these names you might be familiar with, like Anga, Avanti, Kosala, Gandhara, Kashi, Kuru, Panchala. All of these names we are familiar with in Indian history and Indian mythology, because as you would know from the previous discussions, the Kuru kingdom is where the Mahabharata epic took place. And we hear of Gandhara in the context of Gandharan art, the Bamiyan Buddhas, and all of that. And the name is still relevant in that the place is called Kandahar, is an evolution of the name Gandhara in Afghanistan, right? So, and again, the story of the Ramayana takes place in one of these kingdoms as well in the narrative, but the context and the descriptions of it is very different. So this is the period in which 16 or so great kingdoms, and all of them are not kingdoms in the traditional sense, where they have a king ruling all of the people. Some of these are also what we can call aristocratic republics, where a collection of landowning families, upper caste families, come together to elect a king or a leader and then make decisions by a sort of committee. It's an early form of democracy. So we hear about it in the context of Greece, where Athens became the progenitor of democracy, but in almost contemporary India, we already have something very similar going on with the Lichavi tribes, the tribal confederation and such, where an early form of democracy is already taking place. And this is also, again, roughly the period in which in Greece we have Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and all of these people. And the Homerian epics are forming into what we know of them as today. So that period has slightly passed, and they're coming into what is the Hellenistic period when Macedon, which is Alexander, starts to take off towards the end of this period. So that's what's happening in the Mediterranean sphere. I'm just putting the context on the world, just to give everybody an understanding of what's happening. And in India, of course, small kingdoms, the Janapadas, or the place where people's feet touch, where they spread, where people settle, grow into the Mahajanapadas or the great kingdoms, and they start to engage with each other. They start to compete with each other for resources and for control of resources, particularly for trade, because this is when trade really takes off in India. This is also called as the second urbanization. I can't speak today. Second urbanization period of India. The first urbanization is, of course, the Indus Valley civilization, of which we know so little because we haven't decoded the language. The Mahajanapada period is a second urbanization period where cities start to be established again. And proper cities are established where there are royal families, there are trade guilds, there are artisans. So the agricultural surplus that was created when people started settling in the Ganges plain, all of that surplus allowed for people to gain more resources. People had more free time to engage in arts and trade and cultivation of cash crops, cotton, sugar, all of these items, fundamental items for trade that would establish major trade routes all over the world later in history are establishing in India during this time. We have to remember again, indirectly, India is responsible for the transatlantic slave trade because we invented sugar. The sugar plantations in the Caribbean is why black slaves were brought there, and that's how that happened. So again, indirectly responsible, although really we are not responsible. It's the British and the Americans, but you know. And then again, cotton fabric was just created in India, and that would go on to become a major trade good, not just a regular trade good, but also a prestige, elite, quality trade good that other civilizations yearned for. We'll talk about it in more detail when we discuss the Guptas and the Romans. But again, a hugely coveted piece of material from India was cotton, was created and invented during this period, cotton fabric, and spread. So the Indian states were starting to establish themselves as major regional powers at this time. They hadn't become global powers yet, but regional powers definitely. And it is in this context that several great ideas come to be. So the Vedic hegemony had been going on for quite some time now, right? So people were doing these rituals to please the gods like Indra and Varuna. But the context had changed. Brahmins were at the top, but now we see kings attaining more and more power. So why do they need the Brahmins? If they are doing all the battles, if they are expanding kingdoms into great kingdoms, why do they really need the priests? They need them for the legitimacy. They hold the scriptures. All the information that has been collected over hundreds of years is in their heads. Nothing has been written down. We still don't have a writing system in India during this period. The earliest forms of scripts in India are available during the Mauryan period. So that's still a few hundred years away. So all of the knowledge that has been collected all of this time is in people's heads. And these people are the Brahmins. These are the elites who collect the information, who, as we say in Hindi, ratta marna. By memorizing these texts, um, they have collected this information within themselves, so they keep their privilege. Nobody else has access to this information because they have all of it. So the kings still need them. And again, all of this information, all of this knowledge is very valuable, right? But in the grand scheme of things, the Brahmins might still occupy the higher position, but the kings have established themselves as more political, and in a physical sense, they are more expedient. They are more capable because they are the ones who are actually doing things. But the Brahmins keep the knowledge, they collect it, they transmit it to the other Brahmins. So they kind of keep the information within themselves. There is no general education. The common people have no access to it, right? So the rituals continue, but the context is different. As trade grows, individuals outside the Kshatriya and Brahmin fold start to gain more power because money is power. The control of resources is power. So the Vaishyas and Shudras start to accumulate more power within themselves. So there is this imbalance really where people start to question why are we following these rituals when these two groups are controlling everything? But now we have started to gain access to everything. So it's in this atmosphere people start to ask questions about what happens in the afterlife. What is life? What is death? Great questions come into being. And that's the atmosphere in which the Upanishads get to be written or created, where the Indian philosophical school gets traction because people have more time to ask questions. They think about things more. right? They travel among the different regions and come face to face with each other and try to grapple with the realities of life. And it is also in this atmosphere that the first of the heterodox schools come into existence. There were tons of them, but the two most famous are, of course, Buddhism and Jainism. They both come into existence roughly during this period. Roughly 500 to 400 BCE is the period in which these two great teachers come into being. But they were not individuals who suddenly came out of nothing. This was a slow evolution of people starting to wonder what what are the importance of these rituals? What is life? How can we escape this existence if everything we do is predestined? How are we going to find anything in life? What's next? How do we get salvation? Different teachers, different philosophers started to preach their different ideals and ideas, and people started following these ideals, and these heterodox schools started to gain a lot of attention and a lot of political clout as well. And this was a grassroots movement, really, because it's the ordinary people who start to listen to it, right? And it is in this context that Magadha also start to rise. Yes, Alan.
Can you explain the term heterodox a little bit further?
Heterodox in this context means because Vedic religion is orthodox, it is the prescribed cultural and religious milieu. It is a prescribed school of thought. It is a prescribed religious tradition that everybody is supposed to follow because the Indo-Aryan language speakers who call themselves the Aryas, these superior beings who speak an earlier form of Sanskrit and the other Prakrit Indo-European languages, had established their hegemony in this region. They said, this is the way things are supposed to be done, right? Every religion has its own orthodox community, right? When we look at Catholics, when we look at Hindus, the Orthodox community tends to follow everything by the letter as they perceive it. I'm not saying it's true, but it's as they perceive it, right? The heterodox schools are always a response to the orthodox. So they ask questions of the orthodox and try to find different answers to the same problems. So that's the heterodox schools in India. So we call them the Shramana movement because they are uh, in the Malayalam we have the word Shramam, which is to try, right? It's coming
Mm,
from this. So they are trying to find new routes to salvation. Some of them are atheistic in that they don't believe in a god. Some of them are polytheistic in that they believe in all the gods, but they are trying to do different things to please these gods and to have a different way of life. Some of them are hedonistic. They want to enjoy everything in life and follow no rules. The Buddhist school is somewhere in the middle. It's literally the middle path. The Buddhist school means you don't allow yourself to give yourself over to yearning for prosperity or yearning for your desires and fulfilling them. You do what needs to be done. You try to be a good person. You try to do good deeds, but you never go overboard. You don't do too much penance. You don't give too much of yourself. You don't give too much of your family, but you don't go overboard with it as well, right? Jainism is an even more
mm,
extreme. So again, these schools are born in a tradition, in a society that is already experimenting with different ideas. Buddha and Jain Tirthankaras, those philosophers, we'll may discuss them in detail in a further episode. But the idea is because we're discussing dynastic history, political history, really, their importance comes with the rise of Magadha, because the rise of Magadha is directly connected to the rise of Buddhism and Jainism as well, because the first great king of any historical relevance that we have is a Magadha king called Bimbisara. Not Bindusara, Bimbisara. He was a king of the small kingdom of Magadha. At his lifetime, it's still a small kingdom. He rules from Rajgir, and he starts to, have these ambitions of expanding his kingdom, like most kings in later history do. But at this time, Magadha is a small kingdom, this half the size of Bihar, maybe, and he starts to have these ideas of invading his neighbors and trying to establish his hegemony. And one of the ways that he does is he marries one of the princesses of another kingdom, I think of the Lichavi tribe, and that gives him more power from that more prestigious line. And when he dies and his son takes the throne, that kingdom automatically gets yoinked into Magadha. And this son is again even more important because he is the first truly imperialistic king in India, and his name is Ajatashatru. Ajatashatru is prominent in the Buddhist and Jain literature. He has different names in them, like Kunika and stuff. But again, he's the same character. And it is in the internal history of Buddhism and Jainism, Ajatashatru was so ambitious that he imprisoned his own father to take the throne. Again, this is echoed in a few other dynasties and a few other kings' histories later in India's history. We hear about,
Mm.
for example, we hear that Ashoka Maurya goes through a period of violence when he takes over. We hear about Muhammad bin Tughlaq murdering his father, possibly to gain his throne. We hear about Alamgir or Aurangzeb imprisoning his own father to gain the throne. So this is again repeated throughout Indian history, and the trend was set in the earliest phase by Ajatashatru. And Ajatashatru lived during the lifetime of the Buddha, according to Buddhist sources themselves. And based on archaeological and numismatic evidence as well, it is highly possible that it overlaps as well. So we don't know exact dates, but it's roughly 500 to 450s BCE is the period in which this happened. So Ajatashatru comes to power. He has all this ambition and he starts to attack all his neighbors. And he's really good at conquering these neighbors and expanding the power of Magadha. And this is the period in which he establishes a small city by the name of Pataliputra. And this small city that he establishes becomes the capital of Magadha in the next generation and would remain the center of Indian imperial identity for almost exactly 1,000 years from that period on. It goes through several different dynasties following the Haryankas, which is the dynasty of Ajatashatru. They are replaced by the Shishunagas. They are replaced by the Nandas. They are replaced by the Mauryas. Then they are replaced by several different dynasties in an intermediate period. And then they are replaced by the hegemony of the Guptas. And until the end of the Guptas, Pataliputra remains an imperial capital. And it's we can distinguish this period as the Pataliputra period of imperialism in India, really. It's also a Buddhist period, really, because this is, again, a lot of the imperial ideas are based on Buddhism, but we'll talk about it in more detail during the Mauryan period. So it gives you an understanding of how kingdoms first rose, and Ajatashatru's ideas of imperialism were adopted by his successors and other dynasties, and was fully fruitioned during the lifetime of the Mauryas. Go ahead, Alan.
One, where is Patliputra today? And second, where does Alexander come to India? Like, where is that? We're getting to it. Okay, cool. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Patliputra today is underneath the modern city of Patna in Bihar. So again, the imperial identity of India, we imagine it to be towards the northwest of India because we always think of Delhi as the great imperial city of India, right? Patliputra occupied this space for almost exactly the same amount of time, but 2,000 years before.
Mm,
But today's a lot of excavation has been done in this area, and even though in this earlier period we don't have too much archaeological evidence, but from the modern period onwards we get a lot. But we do see that a lot of construction was done in Patliputra even during this period. There were 100 pillared palaces, 1,000 pillared palaces, and great edifices constructed. This was not a planned city per se, but it was created as a major city and then grew into the imperial capital. And it grew in stages and evolved to become one of the grandest cities of the world, equaling Babylon or Rome or Alexandria or Beijing or Delhi or any of these great imperial cities. So Patliputra was one of the linchpins of the global map, and it was established by Ajatashatru. That's why I'm so interested in him as a person. If you study Buddhist history, you learn a lot more about him. Some of the wonderful stories about this period, anachronistic they may be, for example, is the story of Amrapali or Ambapalika. She was a courtesan, and either Bimbisar or Ajatashatru versions differ, was enticed by this courtesan, and he attacked the kingdom in which she lived in to gain her. And then she was like, no, 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 no. If you want me, you can't attack my kingdom. And then he turns back. And in another version of the story, he does attack the kingdom and take the throne for the kingdom. And then she dies. And there are different versions of the story. But it's a very interesting story that I think there's a movie in the 1960s starring the magnificent, the gorgeous, one of the most fabulous actresses of Indian history. I suddenly forgot her name. Vaijayanti Mala. I didn't forget her name. Just teasing. Vaijayanti
oh,
Mala. This Amrapali, and it's a fantastic film. I have it. I've seen it. It's a fabulous film, and you see a little bit of this history in there as well. But yeah, so then Ajatashatru establishes Magadha as the dominant power. Then his sons are replaced by the Shishunagas, who were their subordinates. The Shishunaga dynasty doesn't last for too long again, and it is replaced by another dynasty called the Nanda dynasty. I think the person who created the Nanda dynasty is called Mahapadmananda, and then he had a son called Dhanananda. These are the two names from the dynasty who we know. We don't know exactly how many kings ruled in this dynasty. We don't know if it was two people or if there were more people. But the reason the Nanda Empire is important is because they expanded hugely as an empire by the time we reached the Nandas. From the regional kingdom that was under Bimbisara to a slightly enlarged kingdom under Ajatashatru. The Shishanagas again took over and expanded a little bit. By the time of the Nandas, the Magadha kingdom, think of it as Magadha as one unit, as kingdom, had established its hegemony over almost virtually all of North India. This is the time in which Alexander the Lost, as I call him, Alexander the Invader, Alexander the Conqueror, whatever you want to call him, the warlord Alexander decides to start conquering the world. That was his ambition. His ambition was always to conquer the world, to reach the ends of the earth. That was his ambition. Now, when we think about Alexander, there's two different perspectives that we have to consider talking as Indians. The Western perspective or the world perspective, Alexander stands really tall as a great achiever of many different things. He invaded a lot of lands, he conquered a lot of lands, he defeated a lot of major kings, but primarily he defeated the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which is his real claim to fame. He never lost a battle. That's his real claim to fame. He was really young, he was maybe 20, 25 years old at the time of his death, right? And he achieved so much in his lifetime. From the Indian perspective, nada, nothing. There is no reference to Alexander in any Indian historical records, contemporary or later, until the time of the Islamic sultanates, because Alexander or Sikandar is very important in the Islamic world as well, because they borrowed their histories, they created their histories directly from the Greeks, who borrowed it from the Egyptians as well, and Alexander stands tall in that realm, right? There is no references to Alexander in any Indian historical sources from this period. So I'll give you an outline of the Alexander story so we can see why he's mentioned in this episode. So Alexander, roughly around 327 to 325 BCE, he escapes, expands out of Macedonia, which was a small kingdom in the Greek sphere of influence. He invades and conquers the Greek city states and then expands into Egypt, conquers Egypt, becomes one of the last great pharaohs of Egypt. He called himself a pharaoh of Egypt. And then he attacks and defeats the great enemy of the Greeks, the Persians. If you've seen the movie 300, you see a very fanciful, animated, ridiculous version of that experience of the Greeks fighting the Persians. The Persians were not evil demons or anything, they were the greatest empire the world had ever seen up to that point. So, Alexander's real claim to fame is the fact that he defeated the Achaemenid Persians, who had dominated the world for so long, what the other Greeks couldn't quite do. So, Alexander defeats um, the Achaemenid Persians and yoinks everything that the Persians held. That's how Alexander really established his empire. He didn't do much real conquering. That had already been done by the Achaemenid Persians. He had to defeat the Persians and he took everything that the Persians owned. Right? So Alexander defeats the last Achaemenid Persian king, ends that great empire, and the Achaemenid Persian Empire had by this time reached the Indus Valley. So they had spread all the way from Turkey, what is today
Hmm.
Turkey, Valley in Pakistan. That's how far the Achaemenid Persians had actually conquered and established authority over. So Alexander defeats the Persians, and he now has to come and conquer these areas towards the east in his world conquest. Oh, it's a long episode. It's fun. Okay, and then what happens is that he comes to the borders of India, the borders of Indus, and he fights with an Indian king called Porus, and it's a very difficult battle. It's a very complicated, very difficult, very tough battle for the Macedonians, but they do win. And Alexander is very greatly impressed by Porus, reinstates him as a Satra, or a provincial noble, provincial king of the Alexandrian regime, and then decides to invade further into India. And that's when his Macedonian soldiers say, fuck off. We don't want to go any further. We can't fight any more battles. We have been away from home for 8 years. We just fought a minor Indian army and we barely survived. If we go more east, there are more kingdoms to fight. And at the end of it, there is apparently a great Indian empire sitting right there to whoop our butts. What are we doing? Let's go back. So they basically mutiny because they don't want to face this huge Indian empire that's sitting across from the in Bayas River, right? So Alexander, being childish, is like, please, I want to invade, I want to conquer the world. But his soldiers say, no, 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 not happening. So he, being petulant, takes them down the Indus, makes them go through a really hard route, and a lot of them die. But he makes it back to Babylon and promptly dies. So that's the story of Alexander. So Alexander didn't really invade or conquer India. So that's why he's not particularly known in the Indian context. But there's more reasons why this whole story is not found in the Indian context as well. Because if you look at it, the Indian historical context is always oriented towards the great kings of their period, right? And how that influences regular people and religion. Alexander did none of that. So that's one of the reasons why he's not important in Indian history. The second is that the great battle that he fought in India against Porus. Porus was a minor king who ruled what could be called a minor district at the edge of the Indian world. And even that was difficult for Alexander, right? But because it's such a provincial kingdom that nobody cared about it in
Mm.
Indian, Porus doesn't get any mention in the Indian historical records because he didn't threaten the Nandas. The Nandas never even had to face him. And none of the important kingdoms of the period had any knowledge of this border skirmish happening. So they didn't really care for it. And it didn't influence the Indian kingdoms of the period in any way. It didn't change the political map of India in any significant way. It didn't affect the religious or ordinary life of the people. So again, Alexander's invasion of India, which is basically Alexander's invasion of the borders of India at the time, really didn't affect the whole Indian story in any way at the time. His influences is um, apparent later, but not directly. It's almost indirect. Accidental influence is apparent later. But in real terms, Alexander's campaigns didn't affect the Indian context in any significant way. And we don't even know who Porus was. We have no historical documentation of him. We have barely any historical documentation of the Alexandrian campaign in general from that area. He is very prone to naming cities after himself. So there are several different Alexandrias all over the world, and there is an Alexandria in that region as well. He also named a city after one of his horses. I think his horse was called Baucephalus, and a city was named after him because he died in this Indian campaign. Oh, poor Alexander. So yeah, so by the time the Nandas had established themselves, Alexander comes very close. It's like, when you see asteroid impact scenes in National Geographic or something, something flies and then passes by. That's what really happened. Didn't really change anything in India at the time, but it did have repercussions to the Western world because for the first time, a Western empire was created. It fundamentally changed the way Western civilizations oriented themselves. They, for the first time, had a great empire, although it was still in the shadow of the Achaemenids, and it didn't last. That's another thing that we forget. The Alexandrian Empire didn't last. Alexander died soon after his return from India in Babylon, and immediately his successors were not his children, it was his commanders. They divided up the empire among themselves and started fighting each other. So again, wasn't an empire, it was a minor blip. Um, the Ptolemies established themselves in Egypt. Seleucus Nicator, who got, if you look at the map, it's a huge empire. It stretches all the way from Anatolia and Turkey all the way to India. That's what Seleucus Nicator got. But when you look at it closely, it's mostly barren land. There's nothing there.
Wait, so all he did was go on an 8 year long trek?
Yeah, fighting people, invading. So The idea
But
that
then he never enjoyed anything there, right? Like he never did anything for the empire, did he?
not particularly, he didn't set up an administrative system that lasted. He didn't set up. He set up a lot of cities that lasted. That is true. The whole myth of Alexander was so great that people followed an Alexandrian ideal, but he was not an Akbar. He was not an Iltutmish. He was not a Rajendra Chola or a Rajaraja Chola. He did not establish a stable, long-lasting dynasty or an empire following a linear succession or anything like that. He didn't set up an infrastructure that others could follow. His
Okay, what
administration
is Alexander's contribution to the world,
to the
other than
world,
naming a couple of cities after him?
he could be said he did enable the foundation of Eurocentrism. That's his greatest contribution to the world. But because in the last
Okay.
300 years, that's the perspective from which we see everything else in the world, it has dominated. And again, for a few hundred years before that was the Islamic world. Again, Alexander is important in the Islamic sphere of influence as well. He was important. Before that, he wasn't that important. In the Sanskritic period, in the period of the Indian empires, from roughly 200 BCE to, let's say, 1200 CE, in that period,
Mm.
Alexander wasn't that important in the world. It was only after the rediscovery of Greek antiquity and the general understanding of the spread of Western ideas towards the rest of the world through colonization that he became as great as he is. In reality, he was just another warlord. He can't even compare to Timur or Genghis Khan in reality. If you look at it objectively, they at least established kingdoms and dynasties that lasted. They established systems that lasted. Alexander didn't
Yeah. So he
really,
was like a gang member, gang leader, just having
because he came from
fireworks.
the right prominent gang, which has influence now. He is the great. But anyway, because we're discussing South Asian history, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that
Cool.
by expansionism, Greco-Roman ideas directly came to India because for the first time in India's history, we had a Greek neighbor. That's what actually changed. That's what actually influenced India. So at this time, by
Wait,
the
like Indians got to know that white people exist?
well, we knew we had trade relations with them indirectly.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right? We had trade with Egypt, and they had trade with the Mediterranean small city states of the Greeks. And Rome was just starting to establish itself at this period as well. But they were minor players at best. Egypt was a major
Mm.
player. Mesopotamia was a major player. Then Persia was the major player. And India was, of course, in the conversation as well. Not as a major player, not yet, but that's coming in the next session when we discuss the Mauryas, right? So it is in this atmosphere that the period I'm discussing comes to an end, because
Mm.
slowly Magadha has risen from one of the many kingdoms in India in 500, 600 BCE to the grandest kingdom that terrified Alexander's soldiers around the 3rd century BCE. That's what happened. And Seleucus Nicator inherits the Alexandrian eastern provinces up to the edges of India. And for the first time, India has a Greek neighbor. And it is in this period that a young man, possibly descended from one of the Nandas, decides, hey, what if I follow Alexander's example, possibly, and yoink everything in India? And thus comes to existence Chandragupta Maurya's Maurya Empire.
Yeah.
So in summation, if you look at the notes, this period from roughly 6th century BCE to the 3rd century BCE, 300 years of lots of things happening, but with not too many concrete archaeological or documentary evidence, is very important in Indian history and world history. But we don't give it as much attention because the attention usually tends to revolve around just Alexander.
Hmm.
Another thing I want to mention is where did the idea come to Bimbisara and Ajatashatru that they can expand and they can become great kings? My proposal is that because India at this point had lots of relations with the Achaemenid Persians, it is very likely. that a mixture of Indian ideas of kingship and expansionism mixed with the imperial edifice of the Achaemenid Persians through trades, through nomads traveling between these two great kingdoms. The idea of a great king of kings, of a Shehenshah, which is the idea that the Achaemenid Persians established, seeped into India, and then it spread over the North Indian plains through, cultural osmosis, or maybe even through, representatives of the Achaemenid Persians visiting their Indian territories and then coming into Magadha. Ajatashatru might have thought, hey, if somebody can do that, we hear of this great kingdom over there. Maybe I can expand too. That's precisely what Chandragupta did, but possibly that could be an origin story for the establishment of the first great empire in India. Possibly. This might infuriate people because, again, they will be, oh, we didn't have to steal ideas from the West to get, establish our own dynasties. But again,
Mm.
there are lots of theories. Speaking of theories, the other day I was watching on YouTube a historical discussion, and this was a very serious discussion about the biblical history overlapping with Egyptian history. It was very interesting. These academics talking about biblical history, which is an oxymoron, compared with Egyptian history and the theories. Very entertaining how they try to justify the Moses episode and the Joseph episode as if they're talking actual verified history with actual dates and transposing it on scientific history of the ancient Egyptians.
Send it.
Why?
Send that link, please.
You'll enjoy it because it looks very professional, it looks very reasonable, but when you look at it from even the slightest academic perspective, it starts to fall apart. Because I think one of the episodes said that the princess who adopted Moses was the Queen Hatshepsut. Yeah. Who Hatshepsut? We can discuss Hatshepsut maybe in a separate video because I love Hatshepsut. I do love her. So again, in summation, from 600 BCE to 300 BCE, India evolved from small kingdoms to great kingdoms to the first pre-imperial edifice of Magadha. But around 321 BCE, Chandragupta Maurya realizes that, hey, we can follow that guy Alexander and maybe the Achaemenid Persians and their and create the first true empire in India. The Mauryans we'll discuss in the next episode. Probably we'll do it live. We'll do it live. I don't know that reference, but people might. But if not, we'll catch you in the next episode of Dravidian Does History. I hope everybody had a wonderful time. Did you enjoy it, Alan? Did you enjoy the experience?
I did. I did. I'm just waiting to see how what we're gonna do in the back end after this.
Okay. Well, until I see you again next time, take care. Bye bye. Bye, everybody.
Bye.